To begin, just a general question, if I can. Up until the election of November 2020, whilst there was the availability of absentee voting in America, it was actually only ever a tiny percentage of the population. And for the first time, America went in for, we call it postal voting, you call it mass mail-out voting. And just leaving Donald Trump out of it for the moment, would it not be fair to say that any election that involves mass postal voting has two problems? One, the integrity of that vote. And secondly, that here in America, tens of millions of people had voted weeks before polling day itself and therefore hadn't heard all of the debate.
Well, Nigel, thank you very much for having me, and good evening to all your guests. I did listen to your interview with the former president. And since we're entering the holiday season, I'm going to try to be a little bit kinder than maybe I normally would. What came out of his mouth was so much misinformation, reckless language, and frankly, what came out today was reckless behavior, where it just was a bulletin that he had been tested positive for COVID 3 days prior to his debate with Joe Biden, and where his family and no one wore masks. So let me just begin by saying the blatant disregard for people is just continues as it concerns him. In terms of voting, Oregon, I believe, for many years has had mail-in voting all the time, and many weeks up to and including. The purpose behind our election is to try to be as inclusive of everyone, allowing everyone to have their voice, to make their point, to make their vote, because it is a democracy. So anything that we can do to increase voter participation is a good thing. And when we talk about, well, you know, people, it's rife for fraud or abuse, let's remember that many states did audits 2 and 3 times with very little, such a small percentage of any mischief going on. I think we have to continue to be an open, honest democracy where everyone can participate, and as easy as we can make that happen, the better off we're going to be.
Well, we've had mass mail-out voting in the United Kingdom. It was introduced 20 years ago. We have seen repeated court cases. We have seen people going to prison. And I would like to see, rather like France, where they just don't allow this to happen. Only 2 or 3% of the vote in France is done by people, you know, who are being represented by a proxy or whatever. But here's the point I'm trying to make. You know, you talk about it being a democracy and about wanting to engage people in it. But by the time that first debate had happened between Trump and Biden, 100 million people had already voted. So the point I'm making is, even without discussing the potential for intimidation or fraud, the point I'm trying to make is how on earth can people make an informed judgment on the election if they haven't even heard the debates? Doesn't it make more sense to try and get as many people as possible to actually vote on polling day itself?
Well, I think if it was a national holiday, maybe it'd make it easier. But unfortunately, there are people who work different hours, they work different shifts, they can't always get off on that day. There's lots of reasons why we need to have and make voting easier for everybody. And I will say, if we did that, I would support that. I think a lot of people would support a national holiday. But still, you're going to have people working who cannot get off. Voting in Virginia, it's voting from 6 to 7 p.m. Not everybody can do that. So let's make it open as we can. People can make a determination how they feel about the candidates. A lot of folks do make a determination who vote earlier, and those who are undecided, they wait till later. And that's just the way the system works. And I think it's a good system. Like, again, unless you have a national holiday where everybody can go vote, it's the best system we got.
Well, I'll tell you what 75% of Americans do think. They do think that when you turn up at the polling station, having voter ID, having a clear photograph, official document of some kind with you makes sense, that it supports the idea that, you know, you have elections that have genuine integrity. So big majority of Americans, and that includes just over half of Democrat voters, think voter ID makes sense. And yet, you know, when down in Georgia, it is suggested by some in the Republican Party that this should be the case for all future elections. We see very senior Democrat voices arguing against it, and even, to me, making the ludicrous argument that it's racist to expect people to produce voter ID. Do you see why, given the stance of some very prominent Democrats, it leads the Republicans to believe that the system is being rigged against them?
No, because not everybody owns a car, so not everybody has a driver's license. Not everybody has the ability to travel overseas or has a passport. So how are you going to do that? I think you have to decide, how are you going to give somebody an ID? Right now, you can go to some polling locations and bring your gas bill or bring your tax bill and say to verify who you are. It's not one size fits all for everybody. We're a big country with all different views and different locations and how we get and how we vote and different voting times and places. I think it's important to remember we have to make it as inclusive and available to as many people as possible, not exclusive. Now, I will say, in Virginia, the Democrats lost the election this year, the governor's election, where we all hoped we would, because more and more people came out to vote. So you could argue that those rules helped the Republicans in Virginia this year.
Yeah, the argument I'm making is that I would have thought voter ID, in the modern world, people do have ID. I would have thought that it makes sense. Susan, finally, let me ask you a two-part question. Number one, do you, in your heart of hearts, believe that the mass mailing out of tens of millions of ballots for the November the 3rd election last year was a process that was carried out freely and fairly? And secondly, are you happy for future American elections to be decided weeks before polling day?
I am satisfied we had a great free election. You know, I understand, as a former campaign consultant, I understand election day is a moving target now, but you have to take that into account in terms of your planning and your budgeting and where you get your candidate and when you bring out your ideas and how you motivate people. Would it be easier to have election day on just one day? Sure. But that doesn't take into account not everybody can go vote on that day. Not everybody has the opportunity to get to the polling places. Some people have to take care of family. They have to work. They have kids in school. I would rather see an open, honest election, which we proved time and time again that 2020 was an open, honest election. There was no fraud. There was no abuse. And if there was, it was one or two out of hundreds of millions. I think we have to keep pushing the system to make it more available to everybody to go vote whenever they choose to do so.